Good afternoon again. My name is Deborah Metsger, Assistant Curator of Botany at the Royal Ontario Museum and Curator for the exhibition Florals, Desire and Design on now until January 3rd, 2022. I'm delighted you could join us for today's Curator Conversation, a digital program that explores themes and subjects from ROM collections alongside industry professionals. I would like to take this opportunity to thank TD for their ongoing support of this program and the Royal Exhibition Circle for supporting the exhibition. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the ROM sits on what has been the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabeg Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation since time immemorial until today. I am delighted to welcome my longtime friend and colleague, Dale Leadbeater, to join me for today's conversation. Dale graduated from the University of Toronto as a botany major, then worked in the botany department, administering the Green Plant Herbarium. She later continued her studies in ecology, paleoecology, and taxonomy, and received her Bachelor's of Education from the University of Toronto. After a short teaching career, she became an environmental consultant and restoration ecologist. Dale has continued her association with the Green Plant Herbarium as a field associate of the Royal Ontario Museum, where it now resides, and is a life member of the Field Botanists of Ontario. She has presented talks on many natural heritage topics, organized conferences, and led outings, as well as teaching ecological land classification. An enthusiastic supporter of land trusts, Dale serves on the board of the Couchiching Conservancy and lives on a 200-acre conservation easement near Kirkfield. Dale is the co-author of the newly published Flora of Kawartha Lakes, now available at the ROM Boutique. We will begin today's program with a short conversation about the rich tradition of botanical exploration and documentation from the 18th century to today, and the important role regional flora play in understanding the past and planning for the future. During the program, please submit your thoughts via the Q&A feature on your screen, and we will have some time at the end to answer your questions. Please join me in welcoming Dale to the conversation. Hello, Dale.
Well, thank you. I am awed and honored to be here.
So today our program is celebrating flora from Copenhagen to Kawartha Lakes. The word flora is often problematic for people. It has many meanings, from plants and animals to the description of the plants growing in an era to books that we have. And we're going to approach it in the latter two ways today. So this is the exhibition, Florals, Desire and Design, on at the ROM at the moment. And this is anchored in the 18th century, the origins of floras in many ways. They've gone on many times before that, but this was a zenith in botanical exploration and also in the development of botany as a discipline in its own right that was separate from medicine. People were exploring around the world, and at the same time, they recognized the need to be able to document plants, developing classification systems like the one developed by Carolus Linnaeus, and simultaneously his development of a nomenclature system that we use to this day to describe plants and animals by genus and species. And as books were able to be produced more readily, it was possible to get information out to the masses and to disseminate information about plants so they could enjoy them more. Next slide, please. So one of the projects that was really important at that time was Flora Danica. This was in the Kingdom of Norway, Denmark, and it was a public education program in many ways, started by the Botanical Institute to document the flora of the Kingdom of Norway, Denmark. As you can see from the quotes here, the objectives were to spread plant knowledge as far and wide, and it took over 122 years to produce thousands of botanical illustrations that were then disseminated mostly in black and white to the bishops of the country to get it out to a wide audience. And then in turn, the pastors would gather information about the plants that they saw and send that back to the Botanical Institute. So there was a two-way street. I've discussed this in more detail in a program that you can find online at the ROM, but it seemed like a good comparison to what has been done right here in Ontario with the city of Kawartha Lakes, Flora. Erin, next slide. Dale, can you tell us a little bit about the objectives of the Flora and how does it, what you've done, compare to Flora Danica?
Yeah, it had very similar objectives that we've only just found this out in the last few years, where this need to communicate with the public, to educate, to disseminate information was one of our primary things. We had a lot of enthusiastic volunteers, so we identified a void and we knew how to fill that. But still, it was really important to anchor our work in science so that the results of the work that we did would have a lasting legacy into the future.
Next.
The city of Kawartha Lakes lies right in the middle of central Ontario, and it straddles the Canadian Shield to the north and down through Clay Plain into the Oak Ridges Moraine in the south. And that beautiful necklace of lakes there is the Kawartha Lakes that extend from Lake Ontario through to Georgian Bay. So it really does occupy a unique place in the province and provided huge opportunity for interesting discoveries.
Next. So this is the book. Can you tell us a little bit? I was very privileged to be able to be there when the first 200 copies were delivered the other day. Can you tell us a little bit before we dig into how you produced it? Give me a brief synopsis of what this book is.
Well, we consider this to be a benchmark. This is 2021. This is what our project was able to pull together at this time, gathering all the bits and pieces that we could as we worked. We invested hundreds, no, thousands of hours of volunteer effort to collect the information, press it, prepare it for delivery to the museum. We entered our information into a database that made all of this very accessible to us. And at the same time, we were talking to experts in their fields and learning about the association of landforms, drainage, underlying geology, and the history of the area, including the Indigenous history. So this really is where we are at this time. And I have to say my co-author, Ann Barber, was the one that said, now, enough, we need to get this written. So here it is, but it's not finished. It's just what we know right now.
Next.
It's interesting to find out that, that the earliest Canadian flora was prepared by Catherine Partrail, who she's a very well-known settler that came over into Canada, but she was a writer and she was a member of the upper class. But when she got here, she found that it was really important to start looking at the flora and talking about it, describing it for the benefit of settlers that were coming behind her. And one of the things that she did that we're forever grateful is that she prepared specimens. And there's one in the lower left, the upper right. And that's her lasting legacy to the scientific community. And she was in contact with these practitioners of the day. But what she was using to identify these things was Pursh's Flora of North America, which is all in Latin. So the poor woman couldn't speak Latin, and here she was trying to learn about the flora. We're not in that position today, but we're still using specimens to document and make sure that we've got a solid founding in science. And so it was one of the first things, we can have the next slide, that we focused on with our volunteers. And here's a small group very small group who worked hard to gather these plants from the field, press them, prepare them, mount them. And that's my co-author in the front there on the right-hand side. And they're very proud of the work that they did. And that's going to be, they'll be on file for years.
Next. So yes, and herbarium specimens are incredibly important. And if I can go back for a moment to Flora Danica, this was something that I found as I was looking into some of the illustrations, that they were in fact drawn from specimens. And the specimen that is here, I got from a 2019 paper that had used it to redetermine the name. And so 300 years later, it has not only been the source work of a very important artistic compilation, but also is continuing to play a role within the scientific community and the progress of botany. Next. So Dale, how did this project begin? And we've had a 14-year collaboration between the ROM and the naturalists, and please tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, we didn't think it was going to be 14 years when we started, but we had a committee that designed the project. The ROM, of course, was a stalwart sponsor. And so the top row, here we are down at the Royal Ontario Museum, learning the standard protocols that needed to be used in order to prepare these specimens. We had endless numbers of field trips. I know Anne will know the number of field trips that we had. I don't have it in my head, but it was a lot. And we had our volunteers, of course, that would press the specimens, and there's some standing beside some of their products. As we got better known, more and more volunteers got involved with the project. If I could have the next slide.
Next.
There were just so many people, and then the next, it got bigger.
And more.
And it got bigger. And finally, Ontario Nature heard about our process, and they thought it was worthy of being given this W.E. Sanders National History Award for the work that all of these volunteers had done. This was an award to the club. So we're extremely proud of that, but really the credit goes to the volunteers.
So next slide, please. So let's dig a little bit into this project, and particularly into the book. So can you explain to me how it's organized?
What we ended up doing, because we were not doing individual descriptions of each plant, many floras are like that. This is not like that. The list doesn't have detailed information. And so we felt that we had to put it into context. There had to be some way to interpret that list in terms of where we are in the city of Kawartha Lakes. And so the first chapters, the first 75 pages, talk about the landscape that supports this in terms of terrain, soils, drainage, and occupation. And that's occupation from the original arrival of the indigenous peoples at the time that the glaciers were melting, right up until the present. So the potential for modification of the flora is huge, and it's going on today. And so those are these reflections about what happened in the past and what's happening as we move into the future.
Next slide, please. So as we move out of that wonderful description that we were reading at breakfast this morning into the actual list, tell us a little bit about the list and what's behind it.
Now, one would think that making a list of plants would be a relatively straightforward thing. It is not. There was a lot of research that went into gathering resources. I have to, again, give Anne credit for the incredible work that she did. If you ever need a partner in a project like this, I highly recommend having a professional librarian at your side. Anne brought to this project skills that I, quite frankly, didn't have, and I really give her a lot of credit for this. So we compiled all of the information that we could find from people that we knew that were currently practicing, people that we knew had practiced and had left lists behind. We plundered people's hard drives. We went into herbaria. We did as much as we possibly could to get as many specimens as possible. But then, of course, we had to decide what actually deserved to be on the list and what didn't. And we had to have the most recent scientific names. It's an exhausting process. It takes a long time.
So next slide, please, Erin. So this is the list itself, and I can see that you've organized it by plant family. Explain why you did that there are many different ways of organizing a list. What's the benefit of having it by plant family?
Exactly. I can hear people groaning that, no, what about common names? But common names really don't help you either because they're not standardized. And so we thought the best way to do it is to put it in the order that reflects its evolutionary origins. And one of the benefits to the botanist and the amateurs is that it groups specimens or species that are similar together. So it gives you a clue to help with identification. And then there's all kinds of other field guides that you can use to do that. So that's where we left it. It is beautifully indexed. Again, this is Anne's genius, where she worked so hard to give you an index that's really very useful so that you can find a particular plant.
And I'd just like to add that this is the same way all of these plants have ended up in the Green Plant Herbarium, and they're organized in the same way. So and similarly are now up online through Canadensis, the list of plants in Canada, and everything is in the same order, which is a great asset. Next slide, please, Erin. So you didn't just do a list. You also have done something more, which is to organize these things geographically. Tell us a little bit about that and why it was important.
Yep, we realized once we had the list made that there was no way to comment on where within the city these things occurred. So if we have the next slide, we organized it into what we called the matrix, that you can see that all of the townships of the city of Kawartha Lakes are listed on the upper right-hand side by their geographic location. And so the northern townships of Longford, Dalton, and Digny are grouped together because they are all underlined with the Canadian Shield. So there are specific associations in that geographic area that are unique to those three townships. Now, some of it bleeds out into the north central. Carden, of course, is more limestone, but each of those townships has something distinctive about them. And when you're looking at this, you can see whether or not the plant is something that grows everywhere. And so it doesn't have a lot of restrictions, or ones that are restricted to certain kinds of habitat.
Can we have next slide, please?
So you can see that in the city of Kawartha Lakes, straddling that contact zone, we've got the shield up in the upper left, all this green area to the upper right of the slide is the shield area. So those townships in that part of the city have these unique associations. Meanwhile, Carden, the center, and the Oak Ridges Moraine to the south, they're all separate. And so you can get that out of the matrix.
Next slide. So now we're going to talk a little bit of some of the stories. We can't tell them all, but I think that the historical information and specimens were equally important as you went through this process. Tell us who this is.
Okay, next. When we delved into the history, we found that John McCown, who's illustrated here, he was our Dominion botanist. And he went on the Sir Sanford Fleming expedition in 1872, the famous ocean to ocean trek. He was quite an interesting character, but we found out that he had, and he wrote a Canadian flora that followed up on what Catherine Partrail had done. He was only a year old when Catherine Partrail was writing. And so we found out that he had traveled up the Gull River, up through Elliott Falls and on his way up to Haliburton and Muskoka, and had collected along the way. And we have some of those historical specimens that we were able to add to our database.
So the one shown here is one of the oldest, or of a species that is the oldest that he collected in the city. Next slide, please, Erin. Mm-hmm. So this is a wonderful habitat. What's the origin of this particular landscape?
Yeah, some would not think that this is particularly habitat. And it's interesting because we have similar forests in the city of Toronto on the sand plain out towards the Scarlet Road area and the Humber Valley. But when you first look at this with all its beautiful homes, you think this was a created landscape, a cultural landscape. Whereas in fact, it wasn't, because what told us that is that there are remnant species that are associated with a prairie savanna that we found along the edges of the Sturgeon Lake in this location, which tells us that no, these trees have been here forever. And in fact, when you start to read the pioneer letters back to their folks at home, they mentioned these openings and how they were attracted to these openings because it was easier for them to settle here. There weren't so many trees to take down. So the oak savanna on your right is at Sturgeon Point. This is the oldest settled, the oldest incorporated village in Ontario. And the one on the left is in Finland Falls. This is Maryborough Lodge, which is now the Finland Falls Museum. And they've dated the oaks in this area to 350 years old. And so all of a sudden, rather than just being, oh yeah, some really nice trees and some of them are getting a bit rickety and they need some repairs, but this is the Oak District in Finland Falls. There's a reason why it's called the Oak District. And what we found is that the golf course next to the Sturgeon Lake Point, or sorry, Sturgeon Point, wanted recommendations for what plants should they use to do a restoration project. And so we could tell them that the appropriate plants would be the ones that are associated with an oak prairie savanna. And so that's what they did. So it was really cool that it's come full circle.
And is it not true also that some of the plants like New Jersey tea are actually the host plants for an endangered butterfly? And so
That's
we're
correct.
preserving biodiversity by promoting some of these plants. A great story of into the future. Next slide.
This is just an artifact that Anne noticed in an article that had been written by Jim Soper in the Ontario Naturalist. He mentions this fern having occurred in Finland Falls. And so we looked in the herbarium and sure enough, we found a specimen that Daphne Kay had been a tourist in Finland Falls, and here she'd left behind this legacy. And these escarpment cliffs, that we've got 2 escarpments in the city of Kawartha Lakes, and these cliffs would be the natural habitat. We haven't found this yet, but we're still looking.
But this is an excellent example of how herbaria are used to look for plants and as a resource. Next slide.
Oh, this is one of our favorite stories because it involves our artist that you've been seeing in some of these illustrations. John Vandenberg is a member of the Kawartha Field Naturalist and had agreed to do some of these drawings for us, and he became totally addicted to it. It was wonderful. He found this little tiny orchid growing on the Oak Ridges Moraine on a property that is now under the jurisdiction of the Kawartha Land Trust. We were very excited to find that, and Anne went out and made a specimen. I'd like to emphasize, though, that we made a specimen, but we have very strict ethical rules that govern when you make a specimen and when you don't. So there has to be a really healthy population before you start taking plants for herbaria. But it was a healthy population. Not only was it one of a rare orchid, but it was a rare variety of a rare orchid. This orchid has closed flowers as well as open flowers. We have the open flower variety, which is small but exquisite. John has beautifully illustrated it, and now we have it documented for posterity.
Next slide. Not all orchid stories are as good.
Exactly. So this is another one that one of our members, who was probably one of the best botanists in the Kawartha Field Naturalists at the time, and he was a teacher in the area and just knew everything. He was amazing. So he knew that he had seen this orchid. It's called a ram's head orchid. He knew he'd seen it in the city, but we couldn't find it. We did find a specimen in the herbarium, so we knew it had been there at one time, but everywhere we checked for ideal habitat, it was gone. Since then, there's been document written by the folks that are at the Natural Heritage Information Center in Peterborough to say that this is one of the species that is particularly vulnerable to climate change because it's got a tricky habitat that dries out easily. And these summer droughts are just deadly for this species. So although this species could live in the city, we're not expecting it to see it again.
Next slide. So, places and names. Why do we have pigeons on talk about plants?
Well, this is a really cool one because I've always liked Omimi, you know, and I always thought it was kind of cool that they had a pigeon on their sign. Well, Omimi is Anishinaabe for pigeon. And I was told that it was a family in the area, and that's why it was named. But like there's Pigeon Lake, there's Pigeon River. And I thought, well, what was this family famous for? And like, I'm not buying it. It doesn't make sense. To me, what makes sense, knowing, next slide, that we used to have passenger pigeons, like billions and billions of passenger pigeons. They were the most common bird, 1 in 5. And they were responsible for the massive expansion, explosive expansion of the eastern deciduous forest following glaciation. And these birds went as far north as Timmins. They were just all over the place. And their favorite foods were beech nuts, oaks, chestnuts, hickory. I have a hard time believing they could get hickory in their mouth, but that's what they say. And so they expanded this magnificent forest. Well, Omimi, there's no huge forest around Omimi anymore. There's remnants here, but it's highly agricultural. But when you start looking at the place names, there's Hickory Lane, there's many references to oaks. And so you can understand that at one time, our original or our interim forest would have been this magnificent deciduous forest. So it's really,
slide.
The forest would have looked something like this. This is obviously much younger, and this is in Dalton Township. This one has an acidic soils, and in the acidic soils, we found this particular plant. It's called a common Pip Sisawa. It's a lovely name. And so we made this herbarium specimen that is on file.
Next slide. And lo and behold, it also is a plant that shows up in Flora Danica under a different name, which is an older name for it. But that's because this is an example of a plant that has a circumboreal distribution. That means that it's found all around the world in boreal forests. And I believe, Dale, that in the sites that you found it in Kawartha Lakes, it was in the more northern regions, right? That would mimic the boreal.
Yep, more northern part and in northern sites, so north-facing slopes on the Oak Ridges Moraine.
And this is an excellent plant to illustrate using John's drawing on the right, how it looks kind of insignificant when you're standing up above it. But when you look very closely, it's got a very intricate structure that is absolutely fascinating. Next slide. And that illustrates another point that goes back to the 18th century. And this is the need for a partnership between the people who write and document, the botanists who record the flora, and also the artists. And in the 18th century, this was an incredibly important thing. We didn't have cameras to record things. Dried plants are not sexy. And so the artists, and I've shown here James Sowerby and Sir J. Edward Smith, who are responsible for the publications listed on your screen. And they were really inseparable in the work that they did together. And so for the flora, next slide, please. I had the very great pleasure of meeting John Vandenberg on Saturday. John has done the illustrations for the book, and Dale, I believe he did work extremely closely with you and Anne in producing them.
Well, once he got going, he really produced what he wanted to do. It was amazing.
So in fact, what we have ended up with is an illustrative document. Not all of his illustrations are in the book, but I understand he does wish to keep them all together And this is another incredible document. Next slide, please. Of the flora in an illustrative way. But these are a few that are in the book, and I think you've done a wonderful job, Anne and Dale, of combining the use of photographs and also of illustrations.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in, sorry. It was amazing to me is that John's eye takes him to places that as a botanist, I've never been before. So that this illustration of the Pickleya ash, I wouldn't have recognized it from this because it's so interesting and yet it draws me in. And it was that kind of accessibility when you start to look at these things that makes this book unique in that it's not just a technical book, it's not just a list, but it's something that you can just have on your coffee table and just peruse it either for the artwork or for the stories. It's yeah, it's a little bit different.
Next slide. And it's a wonderful way to celebrate floras. I'm really glad that it came out at the same time as the exhibition. This has been a tremendous amount of work on everyone's part, but I would hazard to say, Dale, it's also been fun.
It's been enormous fun. I'm telling you, we've had so many good times. I'm sure Anne is really glad it didn't take us 123 years to get to the end of it. And for her, I thank her for that. I also would, though, very much like to acknowledge Anne Barber and John Vandenberg for their tremendous contributions. I mean, I'm the talking head here, but I've got them in spirit with me. We are always very tightly knit. I have to thank the ROM for everything that you and your staff did. They're just tireless hours that were put into this. We have to thank the Victoria Stewardship Council, which has since been disbanded. This was really their swan song. They gave us the rest of the money in their budget, well, gave it to the Kawartha Field Naturalists because this is a nonprofit production. All of the proceeds of this go back into conservation. And so the Victoria Stewardship Council recognized that in us. And I'm really glad that we were able to turn it around and give them a benchmark for the end of that association. Many thanks to all of our volunteers and our landowners. And a huge shout out to Phil Holder, who was our publisher from Hawk Owl Publishing. You see the Matt Holder logo there. That is Phil, and he did all of the layout, and without him, we would not have this book in our hands at this moment. So thanks to everybody.
So this product that you can get hold of in the ROM shop, and Erin will also be putting other ways up on screen at the end, is also, I will just add, backed up by the 2,000 specimens that have been donated to the ROM. And people often ask me, where do specimens come from? Well, this is one of the ways. And Dale also mentioned at the beginning that our hope is that this is a tremendous model for documenting the flora of the whole province. And we're hoping at some days, even though we have Flora North America, the regional flora, so moving from counties, and there are others in the works, to one for the province is something that will be very important. So I think we can now thank you all for joining us. We're going to move to the Q&A.
There's a discussion going on about the ethics of collecting plants, and I'm really glad to see that expressed because we are very, very careful when it comes, I guess, what we take, the part of the plant that we take is correlated to what kind of a plant it is and how rare it is and whether or not it's going to continue to propagate. And so, for instance, if it was a rare shrub, we consider that to be pruning. So you can take a little bit of a shrub. But if it was something like, for instance, ginseng, ginseng is photograph only. We would never dig up something like a ginseng. And and as a matter of fact, we don't even publicize the locations of ginseng. We're very protective of that. So that's very, very important to us. And Anne is saying here that she was counting 10 or more plants. I don't know. I think there were times when I made you go to 20, Anne. So I think we were extremely cautious, and certainly for that one specimen, there were a lot of plants there. So it was a decision made to collect.
There's
Anyway,
another question here, Dale, about a natural oak forest. Would they be spaced apart as in the example, or in just the particular oak savanna type in this area? And if I can start on that, a savanna by definition is a widely spaced group of trees. But how does that compare? Do you consider this a savanna?
Oh, it's interesting. The mechanism that drives the formation of these savannas when they're separated out so much, that can come from several places. Well, when you are in a type of soil, either sands that drain quickly, and so there's not a lot of water there, or in the case of the alvar, the soils are very, very shallow and they don't retain water either. So there's just not enough water around to support a really dense forest. And in a case like that, the trees space themselves out and don't create a lot of competition for themselves so that they can survive. The other thing, and this is more common in areas down in Sarnia and Essex, is that the indigenous people down there often use fire as a way of cleaning out the underbrush, because what they are doing is maintaining habitats. This is a well-recognized land management technique in order to maintain either medicinal plants that they are using, or to promote small game because they hunt.
So another question from our friend James Kamstra: how many species disappeared from CKL?
That's an interesting question. I was afraid I'd get statistics questions. I only know of maybe 3 that we have documented, but part of what we did as we went through here was to accept or exclude from the list. And, you know, we're not perfect. We're doing the best we can. We used a lot of floras surrounding. We used Peterborough and work that you did in the Queen Elizabeth II Park, any sources that we could find in the area to find out whether or not these species could be here. And if we could find no evidence from it, we excluded them. And so if you look at the excluded list, some of the plants there likely do occur. And you gave us one of our best examples in that we had excluded the prairie field thistle, Cirsium discolor, but then you found it and put it back on. And so that's what I'm saying about this list, that it's an alive list. This is our understanding of what we have right now, but we're still moving forward to document.
And one other, could you give us a sense of the timeline for the entire project? And we are saying 14 years?
Well, the original discussion started, yeah, that started 14 years ago. Mike Oldham had made a presentation at the Kawartha Field Naturalist. Mike at that time was our provincial botanist, and well, he's pretty much a polymath. He does amazing work on several fronts. And we're just talking afterwards. And he said, you know, it'd be really an interesting project if your volunteers were willing to take it on. And quite frankly, the Kawartha Field Naturalists are such a group of enthusiastic folks. They had taken on several projects and they were game. So we made it happen.
And this one I'll take. Is there a way to volunteer and contribute to future projects and to the ROM herbarium? I will say absolutely. The herbarium is very much dependent on the tremendous volunteers that we've had. And I will add to Dale's shout out that it was they who were in large part responsible. The plants would come to us mounted, but they needed to be labeled and then they needed to be filed, and that's a huge job. So at the moment, there are no volunteers able, thanks to COVID, to come into the ROM, but we're hoping that in the new year that is going to change. And I would suggest that anybody who is interested in volunteering please feel free to contact me through the ROM. I'd love to talk to you. I think that is the end of our program for today. Dale, thank you so much for joining me. Details of upcoming ROM at home programming can be found online and on the ROM's website. And as I said, I have done one on Flora Danica that you can find there. And I invite you to see the exhibition, Florals Desire and Design, and also the other special exhibitions, which are on both Wales and also coming shortly, the Wildlife Photographer of a Year, which is always fascinating to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Have a good day.